Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Elizabeth Hagedorn. I'm the State Department correspondent for Al Monitor, and I'm pleased to be here today with Dr. Majed Al-Ansari, who serves as advisor to the Qatari Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs, and is also the official spokesperson for the Foreign Ministry. In this capacity, Dr. Majed regularly engages with the media, both locally and internationally. He also heads the Center for International Policy Research of Qatar. Dr. Majed, thank you for joining us, and thank you to Qatar for sponsoring this panel. Let's start first with Iran and the critical role that Doha played in mediating this week's prisoner release. Walk us through the mediation track, if you could, and at what point did Washington turn to Doha for its help in this deal?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I mean, I've been following the esteemed guests you had on this chair, so I feel honored. And I also feel quite intimidated to be in this chair now, but hopefully I'll be able to keep up. Let me tell you that the story behind this deal goes back to more than 2 years ago. So starting with the decision by the United States to pull out of the JCPOA, it was very clear that it would be quite difficult to reach more of a positive negotiation pace with Iran from there. And the escalation that happened at that time in the region was scary to all of us, and especially to a country like Qatar, where the sea borders the maritime borders with Iran are closest amongst other countries in the region. And the difficulties that would entail any escalation that happens in the region, we would bear the brunt of such escalation. Therefore, we had a vested interest in protection of our own national security to see how we can de-escalate in the region. And therefore, we started talking to both sides. We had countless meetings and visits between both sides in attempting to return to a new deal or a return to the JCPOA itself. Needless to say that at the time, the escalation was quite high. It was very difficult to get any deals across. But starting 2 years ago, the discussion started about this humanitarian channel that was established in Qatar and the release of the prisoners. The beginning was very difficult. You had two sides completely at odds with each other. There was very little trust remaining after the pulling out of the JCPOA and the escalation that Iran took upon itself in the region and beyond, and therefore there was very little to talk about in these meetings. And I was in Tehran with the Prime Minister and the Minister of State for many visits too. And the discussion was always one-sided. It was very difficult to get points across. The politics of both countries, the politics of the United States, the politics of Iran was always part of the discussion on the table. But I can tell you that at one point, it was very clear that there was appetite for a deal from both sides. And this is roughly less than 2 years ago when we started having indirect talks in Doha first, and then direct talks later on, and of course, reaching the details and the nitty-gritty of the current deal on the financial side that happened just a few months ago, and of course, the prisoner exchange with all its difficulties. And anybody who's dealt with these kinds of negotiations know that last minute you always have these hiccups that come up, and this was not an exception. We had a lot of issues come up at the last minute that jeopardized this deal from taking place, but thankfully, we were able to return the 5 Americans to their families, and we were very happy to see the emotional videos, which we were all, of course, very happy to see here in the US as they arrived here to their families.
Can you talk more about those hiccups? My understanding is the inclusion of 1 or 2 additional Americans delayed this deal. Is that the case?
I can't get into the details of exactly what happened in that time, but I can tell you 2 things. One is that there was always the danger of having additional requests come in at the last minute. And dealing with the Iranian negotiations, this has always been a tactic for the Iranians to throw in these deals at the end. But this was also true for both sides in this discussion, which is trying to get some final thing through the deal. But I think one of the major hiccups happened way before that. And it was when the controversy over the drones in Ukraine took place, because that put everything into a halt, where it was the Iranians were accused of providing drones to the Russians in Ukraine, which was, of course, a major issue for the American side, and it halted the negotiations for a really long time. But beyond that, I think we have reached a point now in the discussion where there is a platform for dialogue. There is a way to talk, regardless of how difficult it is. I think we're at a point now that is quite optimistic as opposed to a couple of months ago.
Do you sense that, was there a turning point at some point earlier this summer, or when did you feel that the two sides were getting close to seeing this deal happen?
It was quite gradual. So I wouldn't say that one exact point in the past couple of months was the turning point that made this deal possible. But you could see it breaking up as we were going along and kind of coming together very slowly. I think one of the major drivers behind this was the pressure of time on both sides. Time wasn't working good for both sides. On the Iranian side, the economic situation is quite dire. The situation there is not easy, even when it comes to essential products that are needed for day-to-day life in Iran. And there is a lot of pressure locally from public opinion in Iran also over this. And the Iranians needed such a thing. And they also needed to maintain their narrative. So they couldn't be seen as offering concessions as part of this. And you probably all heard the statements coming out of Iran that are trying to maintain the narrative that they didn't make any concessions, which of course they did within the deal itself. And on the other side also we have, next year is an election year here in the US, so it's understandable that if something like this would have happened, it had to happen within this time frame.
I'm sure you're familiar with the criticism over the financial arrangement involving the unfreezing of Iranian assets. The Biden administration counters by saying the unfrozen funds could only be used for heavily scrutinized humanitarian purchases. But given that money is fungible, is Qatar at all concerned that this money could be reallocated by Iran, that Iran could reallocate its domestic budget for nefarious purposes?
So let me start with one thing here, which is that our job as a mediator in this process was to make sure that prisoners come back home and that the humanitarian channel is secure. Secure in a way that would guarantee the Iranians that they would be able to use it realistically. And secure in the way that it will not be used for anything that would fall under US sanctions, or that would enable the Iranian government to do something that is not accepted in the international community. And therefore, in that part of the negotiation, you had three parties on the table. You had the Qatari, and the Qatari financial structure was sitting there on the table, and you had the Americans, and you had the Iranians, and every party had their conditions, and that was the longest part of the discussion in this negotiation, the more difficult part of the discussion, because the technicalities of how to make sure that every request that comes in to the humanitarian channel for buying food products or agricultural products or medicine or medical equipment only would go through the process in a way that would make sure that no money would go to any place other than where it is intended towards the Iranians. And of course, the magnitude of the number, I mean, we're talking about $6 billion here. We've taken a big responsibility in Qatar to make sure that this amount doesn't change the status quo right now in the political side or in any other situation. And therefore, we have the guarantees in place. We are working with the United States, with the Treasury, and with other institutions here and in Iran to make sure that the process is very clear, very transparent, and very monitored to enable it to succeed in being a platform or being a driver for further negotiations.
So you're confident Iran couldn't misuse even $1 of these funds?
I can tell you that from the American perspective, the administration put in place all the safeguards possible to make sure that doesn't happen. And from our perspective, we are very keen to keep our records as they are, very clean and very open and very transparent on financial issues. It's our reputation on stake. Not only our reputation, it's our financial sector that is on the hot seat here. And this is why we have a vested interest to make sure that this process is as transparent and as safe as possible.
Looking ahead, do you see your country playing a role in additional efforts to de-escalate tensions between Iran and the West, including restarting nuclear diplomacy?
So this is, it might be an obvious answer, but it's in our national interest, and therefore it's something that we want to do. But the logic behind it was when we saw the situation deteriorating between Iran and the 5+1, our main concern was how can we get back to a place where negotiations can take place, even if there is no deal in the horizon. And the way forward that we found was compartmentalizing the disagreements between Iran and the United States first, and then Iran and the 5+1, and Iran and the region, in a way that would make it possible to make these small wins on the negotiation track. And I think what happened here today, getting this deal in place, is a very good indication of what could happen when you compartmentalize and you try to address specific concerns at each inflection point. And right now, this deal and the humanitarian channel in place in Doha will allow for much more discussions in the future, much more negotiations, and I can tell you that there is appetite there from both sides. There is a lot of political will, but also political leverage that might affect the decisions in the future to continue with this track. But we are committed as a mediator to continue on this. We will be pushing for it. We will be an active mediator on this, not a passive mediator. And we are hopeful that through this channel, we'd be able to make our region more secure, and to be able also to convince the Iranian side and the rest of the world that dialogue is the way forward in this issue and not confrontation.
Outside of Iran, where else is Qatar looking to offer its mediation services?
We're all over the place. So, I'll give you a couple of examples. We have a renewed interest in being an international mediator. We pride ourselves in being a trusted international partner. We've worked on countless issues in the past. We had a success in Lebanon post the war. We had success in Darfur, which actually is even relevant today in Sudan with the current situation. And we've worked between Djibouti and Eritrea, with Chad, and between the government and the opposition. And I can go on and on with these examples. But what we are doing right now, one of the main issues we're working on right now is the DRC and Rwanda. There's been a lot of animosity there and on the border areas, and we are working with both sides in coordination with the Americans to make sure that we can reach some kind of agreement over there. We're working with Lebanon now to fill the void in the presidential seat. We had the five-state committee in Doha. They held the meeting over there, and we are working with them now. Our Minister of State, who's responsible for mediation, is taking point on this. We are working in Afghanistan, of course, and Afghanistan is a very important topic for Qatar. We are highly invested in that issue. We are working in mediating between Afghanistan and the rest of the world, basically. So a lot of things to be done, and we always say, there are only on this earth 340,000 Qataris. So each of us has like 10 jobs doing different things. And when it comes to these mediations, all of us are pitching in, but it's certainly difficult, but it's something that we pride ourselves on in Qatar, in paying a dividend for our prosperity.
Well, because you mentioned Afghanistan, Qatar played a big role in helping with evacuations there and still plays a part in communication with the Taliban. In May, it was reported that your prime minister held secret talks with the supreme leader of the Taliban aimed at resolving tensions with the international community. Where do those efforts stand?
Well, they're no secret anymore, I guess. Since the collapse of the government in Afghanistan and Taliban forming the interim government, or the de facto government over there, our main concern was that to tell the rest of the world that we have tried isolating the Taliban. We've tried waging a war on the Taliban. It has not changed the status quo. It didn't make the situation of women better in Afghanistan, didn't make the situation when it comes to radicalization better in Afghanistan. And the only way forward is engagement. We fully understand that the situation in Afghanistan today is not easy for the international community to engage with the current government. But complete isolation is not the solution. It didn't work. It will not work. It will push the government right now over there into the hands of other states which would not be very much interested in human rights and the rights of women and children in Afghanistan. And therefore, we have maintained our position as a mediator. We've brought in, we don't have a security role to play in Afghanistan, of course, because of the current situation. We are not interested economically in Afghanistan because it's not a good business decision to have investing in Afghanistan at the moment, but we are fully invested when it comes to the humanitarian side and to being a mediator between Iran and the rest of the world. We represent U.S. interests in Afghanistan at the moment, and many of the diplomatic missions of the European Union in Kabul are now located physically in Doha. Most of the meetings that take place between representatives from the Taliban and the rest of the world happen in Doha, and we were able to make an important breakthrough in the not-so-secret meeting you mentioned in Kandahar. That was the first time that the leader of the Taliban met a non-Afghani person altogether. And we're talking here about the prime minister of another country. And on the table of discussion was the rights of women and children in education, how women can be quite important in Muslim communities and thrive and be successful in Muslim communities, and how that does not contradict Islamic law and Islamic principles. And of course, the issues of how to deal with the rest of the world. And we listened to what the Afghani side had to say about their concerns about the world. Our concern right now is that the issue with Afghanistan is a problem with narrative at many times. Other countries would tell you, governments from other countries would tell you, we'd like to talk to the Taliban, but politically it doesn't look good for us to do this when it comes to public opinion. So we're ready to engage with them, but we're not ready to take any steps. And the problem with the situation in Afghanistan is public shaming doesn't work. To go on statements, criticizing the Taliban all around the world all the time, it doesn't work. It only helps push the radical narrative in Afghanistan, because now the radicals within Taliban are basically saying to the not-so-radicals, see, this is what we told you. They will never accept you. They will never talk to you. You have to, fend for your own and just do whatever we were doing in the past, which is, block the borders and keep everybody out, and we'll establish an Islamic State in Afghanistan. Engagement has always helped the not-so-radical elements within Taliban to push their case, and this is what we hope to do right now, is to make them, to empower them to push more for issues like women's rights and the education in Afghanistan, and also engaging with the international community. What we found is that the more they engage, the more they become willing to listen. And we had, through an NGO in Qatar, a think tank that works on mediation, we had officials from the Iranian governments take training on human rights. And you can imagine this, but Talibani government officials sitting in classrooms, taking courses from people from the UN on human rights and the international law around human rights, and having discussions with people who work within the international community. This kind of eye-opening exercise is very important to us, because at the end, Taliban is like any other structure of leadership. You have people at the top who are quite, ideological and very, but you have also the final rank that you need to introduce these kind of general ideas to, and to kind of pull them into the international community.
I'd like to switch gears to how your country is balancing its relations with China and the United States. Does Qatar share some of its neighbors' desires to bolster relations with China, or do you fear any long-term cost to the U.S. alliance or Qatar to deepen its relationship with China?
Well, when it comes to our alliances, we've always been very clear. We're very proud to be designated as a major non-NATO ally here to the United States. We had a strategic relationship with the United States for many years now, and 11,000 American servicemen and women are based in Doha. So there is no question when it comes to the Qatari government, when it comes to my government, that our strategic alliances with the United States. However, our main source of income is exporting LNG. And our biggest client when it comes to LNG is China. So we have a very strong economic partnership with the Chinese. We've been working with them for many years on that front. We don't see eye to eye with them on many issues, especially their handling of the Uyghur issue and other issues relating to human rights or to regional and international matters, but we have a working relationship with them. And we've always said that it doesn't work for the whole world if there is a polarization that asks countries, you're either with us or against us. We are working right now with the United States on myriad of issues around the region, but we are also working with the Chinese when it comes to the economic side. What we need to see here is we need to see more dialogue. We need to see a way that addresses concerns from both sides, but also there needs to be an openness to understanding that there are a lot of challenges when it comes to isolating Chinese influence in the world. We have to do a lot of measures for de-risking. We've been pushing in the European Union and in Europe to expand and diversify our clientele when it comes to energy. And we've been telling the Europeans for a really long time that, listen, you need to start buying your energy sources from other places than Russia, or you're going to find yourself at a very risky place in the future. That, of course, has happened. And we are able now to sell our LNG to Europe in order to diversify. But the fact of the matter remains that China is one of the biggest producers in the world, and it's one of the biggest markets in the world. We will always need it. It will always need us. There's no way of completely isolating China. We shouldn't allow this economic pressure to be used for political matters, and this is why we've always said when it comes to energy and when it comes to economy, decisions have to be taken in an isolated way. Not to say that there should be a China wall, between the business decisions and political decisions, but there shouldn't be, nobody should be allowed to use and weaponize energy and weaponize markets in a way that would make them be able to push their own agendas. And it's something we believe in, and this is how we govern our relationship with both China and the rest of the world.
I'm hoping we can squeeze in one more question. Your country held the World Cup nearly a year ago. Do you think the tournament was successful in bolstering Qatar's international standing in spite of the heavy criticism over workers' rights and free speech during the tournament?
So if somebody asked me, why did you organize the World Cup in Qatar, I'll tell you three things. One was every infrastructure push in Qatar was linked to an international event that happened in Qatar. And anybody who came to Qatar before the World Cup and post the World Cup can see, the complete overhaul of the country that took place. We always need to have that, finish line in front of us in order for the country to be galvanized in one direction. Two, it was for international recognition, of course. And three, it was because of a belief that our area, our part of the world was always stereotyped, stigmatized as being, the capital of all the crises in the world and hate and radicalism and all these things, and we wanted to show a different picture. And I think we succeeded very clearly in this. We did a lot of surveys before and post the World Cup to see, how it affected you. And I can tell you that, especially in places like Latin America, in Asia, in Africa, recognition of Qatar has increased incredibly. The emotions behind identifying Qatar and understanding what Qatar has changed completely in these parts of the world. Wherever we go, we fly with the PM to all sorts of countries around the world, and every time we get there, say, listen, we saw a different thing there. And yes, we got a lot of criticism. We don't agree with most of that criticism. We believe that we were signaled out on things that were not necessarily true, or that were a bit stereotypical of how you would read the region itself. But when the tournament happened, everybody came, everybody enjoyed it, everybody found it safe, secure, and I'll finish off with this so I don't rant about this a lot. I had an interview with an Australian journalist who told me, Majed, listen, I've been covering these international events for more than 20 years now. And I can tell you how many times I was beaten, I felt scared, I was attacked during this international tournament with, rowdy fans coming out of games and pushing my cameraman. This is the only time in all my 20 years that I feel completely safe to go wherever I want during the tournament, attend all the games without feeling any fear for my own security. So this is something we're proud of, that we were able to provide this kind of safety. And we were able also to show the world what it means to be Qatari, what it means to be Arab, what it means to be Muslim and part of this world.
I am afraid we are out of time. But Dr. Majed, thank you so much. This was a very enlightening conversation. I appreciate it.